From the mid-1970s to the early 1980s, a serial killer would torment Yorkshire, England. In his wake, he'd leave 13 women dead and have at least 7 survivors. The killer would drift extremely close to police at times, coming so close as to be interviewed on numerous occasions. But police blunders over the years, the large scope of his crimes, and public apathy toward the targets of his crimes kept him from being apprehended for over 5 years. On June 2, 1946, Peter Sutcliffe was born into a large family in West Yorkshire. He was a small baby, weighing just 5 pounds at birth. As a child, he was quite attached to his mother. Sutcliffe didn't have any friends and was bullied by older boys at school. He would leave school at 15. It's said that Sutcliffe had a morbid and awkward sense of humor. He even got a job as a gravedigger as a young man. He'd marry his wife Sonia in 1974, and by 1975, he'd kill his first victim. Early on, Sutcliffe had developed a fascination for sex workers. He would often drive through red light districts to spew hatred at sex workers as he passed. He would go on to commit his first known violent act in July 1975 when he attacked a sex worker for revenge after claiming another sex worker had run off with 5 pounds without providing services. The woman survived and Sutcliffe was even identified, but she chose not to press charges. He'd attack at least one more woman who would survive before his attacks turned deadly. On October 30th, 1975, 28-year-old Wilma McCann would become Sutcliffe's first murder victim. She was a mother of 4 from Leeds who made money as a sex worker. She was killed just 100 yards from her own home on the Prince Philip playing fields. Sutcliffe picked her up and then beat her with a hammer and stabbed her in the stomach, chest, and neck. Sutcliffe would later reflect on the first killing. After that first time, I developed and played up a hatred for prostitutes in order to justify within myself a reason why I had attacked and killed Wilma McCann. Sutcliffe's next victim would be 42-year-old Emily Jackson, also killed in Leeds on January 20th, 1976. The mother of 3 was a known sex worker who was taken to some abandoned buildings by Sutcliffe, where he struck her over the head with a hammer and used a sharpened screwdriver to stab her more than 50 times. However, Sutcliffe left behind some evidence, a boot print on Jackson's thigh. It would be another year before Sutcliffe would successfully strike again. On February 11, 1977, he would target Irene Richardson, a 28-year-old woman living in Leeds. He would kill her on Soldiers Field in Roundhay Park with his typical weapons, a hammer and a knife or sharpened screwdriver. After this killing, he rearranged her clothing, covering her with her own coat. This time, a tire print would be left in his wake. A few months prior, Sutcliffe attacked pregnant 20-year-old Marcella Claxton in the same park. He struck her over the head with a hammer, but Claxton was able to fight him off and make it to a phone box to call for help. Claxton received many stitches for her injuries and miscarried, but ultimately survived the attack from the serial killer. Claxton provided a description of her attacker which was turned into a sketch. The resulting image turned out to be a great likeness of Sutcliffe, but because Claxton was not a sex worker, she was not initially believed to be one of the Ripper's victims. The blunder would be a sign of what was to come in the ensuing investigation. A couple months later, April 23, 1977, he would strike again. Patricia Atkinson was a 32-year-old mother of 3. She was murdered in her own Bradford apartment after drinking in the pub with Sutcliffe, marking the first murder outside of Leeds. Yet another clue was left for police at the scene as he left behind a boot print on her bloodied sheets. Sutcliffe would earn the moniker the Yorkshire Ripper after the discovery of his youngest victim, 16-year-old Jane MacDonald, June 26, 1977. Sutcliffe spotted the young shopkeeper on her way home from a night out near a playground in Leeds. She was one of the only few victims of Sutcliffe who did not do sex work. Her body would be discovered on the playground by 2 children the following day. MacDonald's death sparked outrage from the public as she was deemed the first innocent, aka non-sex worker, victim of the killers. His previous victims were subjected to victim blaming because of their jobs. It was Sutcliffe's fifth kill that would bring him face to face with the police. Sutcliffe would pick up 20-year-old Jean Jordan in Manchester's red light district, October 1, 1977. After murdering her, he'd dump her body and belongings. But Sutcliffe soon regretted that move when he realized that a 5-pound note that could possibly be traced back to him was still in her bag. He'd returned to her body 9 days after murdering her, only to find the note nowhere to be found. Police believe that the killer moved her body out in the open when he searched for the bill, which allowed a dairy worker to discover the body the next day. They also believe that the killer subjected Jordan's lifeless body to even more violence when he returned to it. Ultimately, the police located the note in her pocket and traced the serial number back to the payroll of the company where Sutcliffe worked. He was brought in for questioning twice, but the police believed his alibi, backed by family, that he had attended a housewarming party. While Sutcliffe would strike a few months later on January 21, 1978, when he killed 21-year-old mother of two Yvonne Pearson in Bradford, her body would not be discovered for another 2 months. Additionally, the attack was interrupted when a car pulled up next to his car in which he had Pearson. He'd stuff her mouth full of horsehair to keep her from screaming as he killed her. When he was done, Sutcliffe would help his parents move into a new house just hours later. 10 days later, January 31, 1978, he'd attack and kill 18-year-old Helen Ritka, whom he picked up from a spot frequented by sex workers. On May 16, 1978, Sutcliffe would kill a mother of 7. 40-year-old Vera Millward of Manchester was killed in Manchester Royal Infirmary, and her body was left in the car park. Sadly, a man nearby had heard Millward's screams as she was being murdered, but due to the location, he assumed they were coming from a patient in the hospital. The next victim of Sutcliffe's was 19-year-old Josephine Whitaker, who worked at a building society. She was murdered on April 4, 1979, when she was walking home from her grandparents' house. 21-year-old student Barbara Leach was murdered on September 2, 1979, within feet of her own home in Bradford. Sutcliffe stuffed her body under the steps leading up to the back door of her apartment and piled up some trash bags to cover her body. Sutcliffe's next murder is one of particular note, as the method of killing differs from all his other attacks. Unlike the other victims, 47-year-old civil servant Marguerite Walls was strangled on August 20, 1980. Because of this, her death was not initially connected to the Yorkshire Ripper. After that, he'd only strike once more. On November 17, 1980, Jacqueline Hill, a 20-year-old student in Leeds, was killed on her way home from a workshop. For his last kill, Sutcliffe would return to his usual weapons. It's reported that at the news of her death, then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher demanded to travel to Leeds. She was upset that the investigation had still not found the killer and that he was able to take yet another victim. In order to catch the culprit that had been terrorizing Yorkshire, the Ripper Incident Room had been established at the Millgarth Police Station in Leeds. This room utilized a card index system which would quickly become overwhelmed. Due to this, information was not properly cross-referenced, allowing key identifiers of Sutcliffe, like his small feet and the gap in his teeth, to fall through the cracks along with other evidence against him and extending the investigation for far too long. Additionally, there were several other factors which made the hunt for the Yorkshire Ripper even more difficult. Because he mostly targeted sex workers, many innocent men who were customers of sex workers didn't come forward to eliminate themselves from the investigation. On top of that, there just wasn't much concern from the public for the women who were being targeted because they were sex workers, a job the public saw as having an inherent risk of murder. The large area across which the crimes occurred also complicated things, as multiple cities were involved, and significant amounts of time elapsed between attacks. And of course, the investigation was dogged by hoaxes like many high-profile cases. One hoax in particular threw police off the scent. a detective constable interviewed Sutcliffe in his home after the murder of Barbara Leach. He had noted the similarity between a description of the attacker and Sutcliffe, as well as the fact that his shoe size matched the culprit's exactly. The detective noted his suspicions and the fact that there was something sinister about Sutcliffe. But there was a problem. A tape and some letters that were sent in to the police were initially believed to be authentic. So much so that police diverted their investigation and resources away from Yorkshire to Sunderland due to the accent on the tape.
I'm Jack. I see you are still having no luck catching me. I have the greatest respect for you, George. But Lord, you are no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started.
Despite the detective's strong intuition, Sutcliffe's handwriting and Yorkshire accent did not match the tapes and the letters, and therefore was not a legitimate possibility at the time. Of course, the tape and letters were found later to be a hoax, and the man responsible would be sentenced to 8 years in jail for interfering with justice. Even more shockingly, Sutcliffe was brought in 9 times to be questioned by police. In one of these instances, he was shown a photo of the boot prints found at 2 of the scenes, Emily Jackson and Patricia Atkinson. However, the police failed to notice that Sutcliffe was wearing the exact pair of boots which had made those prints. There are also reports that Sutcliffe was once arrested for drunk driving, but when he was checked against the Ripper incident room files, he had been eliminated from the inquiry. A friend of Sutcliffe's even went to police after he started to believe his friend might be the killer, but there was no follow-through with this tip. Finally, Peter Sutcliffe was caught on January 2, 1981 in Sheffield when officers stopped him in his car with a sex worker. Officers allowed Sutcliffe to use the side of the building to relieve himself, and later discovered he'd thrown a hammer and knife on his way to the building. His wife Sonia had been questioned about his whereabouts on the night of an attack on a teenage girl. She confirmed that he didn't return home until 10 p.m. that evening. On January 4, 1981, Peter Sutcliffe finally confessed to being the Yorkshire Ripper after 2 days of questioning. He would say, "The Yorkshire Ripper, it's me. I killed all those women," before spending nearly 24 hours detailing all his crimes to police. He asked for his wife to be brought down so he could tell her himself. Sutcliffe would plead not guilty to murder due to diminished responsibility, as he claimed that he was killing the women because God told him to kill sex workers.
Sutcliffe said today that his mission to kill began here, Bingley Cemetery, where as a teenager he worked as a gravedigger. It was something I felt was wonderful. I believed then and now that it was the voice of God.
He would, however, plead guilty to manslaughter, but the jury would ultimately find Peter Sutcliffe guilty of 13 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder on May 22, 1981. He was given 20 concurrent life sentences and a recommended minimum of 30 years. At last, the Yorkshire Ripper was finally behind bars. The High Court would rule in 2009 that Sutcliffe should never be released. Nearly 40 years after his arrest, Peter Sutcliffe tested positive for COVID-19 on November 7, 2020, and would die just days later after reportedly refusing treatment. All in all, a team of 200 people carried out more than 130,000 interviews, visited 23,000 homes, and examined up to 150,000 cars over 2.5 million hours trying to apprehend Sutcliffe, making it the biggest manhunt in British history. A fact that even surprised Sutcliffe. It was just a miracle they did not apprehend me earlier. They had all the facts.